know if there's a pretty side or not. Use that side. We'll talk about that in a second. Good morning. It's so good to be here. We've been walking through Galatians, and I finally get the application part. It's been fun. Paul, our writer, loves to make lists, and I see an awesome list in chapter 6. We're going to be in chapter 6, verses 1 through however far I get. I don't know if it's going to be 10 or 3, so I have no clue, really. Like always, this is just from my study. Don't look up and see me and go, oh, that's the guy that has the answers. You will be sorely disappointed. This is the guy that read this passage over and over. And I just said, you know, I'm going to use my education, my experience, and my study to kind of come here and talk a little bit about this to you guys. And so hopefully that is encouraging to you and challenging in a way. Paul has that way of pulling us into his writings and challenging us. And I don't know if he lightly steps on our toes, but maybe he just keeps a good pressure there that helps me to think about my world. Paul's a great way of helping us see the world the way God sees the world. And that's something that I am always encouraged to do, to look out at our world and think, God, what do you see right here? Often with our time downtown with the street kids, we take people on a tour walking around downtown, and we point out sometimes you'll see a pile of trash where people have just discarded what they were using right where they used it. Oftentimes it may be 30 or 40 cigarette butts and maybe a few bottles of assorted flavors. And you can tell they're all in one set area. And if you walked up on that, you would say, that is absolutely horrible that someone would just throw their trash on the ground right here. And that is a way of seeing it. But also you can look at each cigarette butt and think, how long did someone have to sit here and smoke that many cigarettes? And what was going through their mind? And what does God know about those folks? That God sees that trash and he says, I see the life. I know the lips that cigarette touched. And I know the lips and the heart that bottle brought temporary comfort to. That God sees our world, his world, in a way I want to see the world. And I think Paul helps us do that too. Paul has been talking in Galatians recently with the last chapter about freedom, and I think we showed some illegal videos and stuff, and we're not illegal. We showed videos, and then we learned that, you can't put those on YouTube. We're learning as we do this broadcasting stuff. I will have no videos today. But we saw this freedom, and we've seen how Paul has challenged us to live a certain way, to take the perspective in life that you can live this way. Now imagine this group of folks that have been living their life with a set of rules. And you've lived these certain rules, and then all of a sudden someone says, you're free. Right. Now what do? I mean, that's kind of terrifying if you think about it. At 18, I know 18-year-olds, you're living under your parents' rules at 18, they just say, see ya. How many of you are willing to even do that to your children? Much less to think that that's what God would do to his children. That he would say, here you go. Well, we're done with that part of your life. Now just go live this way. I don't think that's what Paul means by freedom, because that would be bondage. That would be hard. But you remember there's this little verse about Jesus that said he came to fulfill something. Fulfill something. To fulfill the law. To do it in a way that had never been done before. I put this title as this law filled full. To live in the law when it's completely full, what would that look like? I believe the original hearers and recipients of the law always had that ability and the challenge to live the law filled full and what it would look like. And that didn't mean just bearing each burden. And we can see the path that they took on that was to write a book about this thick on how to live the law that was this thick. Well, if we come up with all the details and all the things and all the great wise people tell us how to do it, and it's like God was saying, you're missing it. And so one day he said, I'll show you myself. I'll show you myself what it looks like to live this law filled full. And Paul's word is, it looks like freedom, and it comes in the form of Christ. And last part of this chapter, or the first part of this chapter, last part of chapter 5, talks about living in the sinful nature and living in the fruits of the Spirit and how beautiful that is. And then he gets us to our chapter 6, verse 1. He says, brothers, if someone is caught in sin, you who are spiritual should restore him gently. But watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. And of course, you look at those two lists of living in the sinful nature and living with the spirit of love, and you're like, man, that is a massive list. But back up the whole book and notice he could be talking about those who are doing things by the order of the law and getting caught up, wrapped up in this law keeping, and how tempting it is when you create a new law to say, I don't do that law anymore, just keep creating these laws, and now you're tempted to say, we don't do it that way anymore, we do it this way. And all you've done is created a sinful nature for yourself to just double the laws instead of isolating them. So it's more than just this sinful nature, it's an approach to life. Now, is Paul just lawless? Is he a lawless person? He's like, I have no law. I think we've seen Paul do many acts of keeping the law, haven't we? I think we've seen time in Paul's life where when he comes back to Jerusalem, he actually goes through the rites of purification, shaves his head, goes through the 7 full days, because the elders in Jerusalem church said that would be the best thing to do. So Paul did it. We know in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he talks about he became the law. He would keep the law for those under the law and not keep the law for those that are under the law to win those for Christ. He knew what it was like. But was he under a law? Absolutely he was under a law. He was under a law that had been filled full. And he'll call it in 1 Corinthians 9 that he was under the law of Christ. Think about that. Have we decided that, well, the law is gone, so we're just done? Or have you accepted the law you're under? Do we accept the fact that we live in the law of Christ? That's the law that manages and keeps us moving every day, this law of Christ. What does that look like? Well, it's something about this law that allows us to restore brothers gently who are caught in sin. I'm not sure that we've done a really good job with that as a historical group of people, have we? But it's something that Paul says we could do. Those who are spiritual, restore them gently. That law of Christ teaches us how to do that. The law of the first givings of the law had that ability, but Christ had to demonstrate how to do it. And I always go back to the way God does it all the time, and that's on the cross. That's the sacrificial love of God. In verse 2, the verse that really stands out to me in these 10 are carry each other's burdens. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. And there it is in this, the law of Christ. And I can tell you, I've been sitting on that for a week. What is the law of Christ? It doesn't have to go, you don't have to go too far back, just chapter 5 where he says the entire law is summed up under this single command, love your neighbor as yourself. That would probably fit really good for a law of Christ to be under, wouldn't it? Do we really want that, though? Because that's pretty hard. That's not something you go, well, I just say it. You have to do it and mean it. That's a tough one, and I think that does show the law of Christ. But what else is there? What is this? Carry each other's burdens. Well, that brings me to this milk jug that I borrowed. There's a story behind this milk jug. It's painted up, all nice with people, I guess, round people. This milk jug has a history. It was borrowed from a person that was part of their burden. A milk jug. Now, their burden was they didn't have to get up in the morning and milk cows. That wasn't their burden. Their burden wasn't that they have to figure out what to do with this beaded, dented up old milk can. The burden that was buried with that milk jug and other items was the burden of a young 13, 14-year-old girl. that this milk jug was part of. This 13-year-old girl had watched her mom suffer with cancer for a while. It was horrible. The youngest of her family, her older brothers had mostly moved out of the house. And so there were times at night where mom just screamed with pain. And this girl and her brother that's 1 year older than her, a few years older than her, would sit on the back porch with their dad, not to ignore mom, but just to have some peace, to try to have discussions while others were caring for her mother. Not too long after her 13th year, right at her birthday time, her mom passed away and had the funeral, and she went on with life. Her dad wasn't sure exactly how to carry this burden for a 13-year-old daughter. How did you bear that burden, that spiritual burden, that loss? Maybe if we kind of got the picture of mom's stuff out of the house, that would maybe in a dad's thinking, maybe that was part of it. As you take some of the items that reminded of mom, and maybe that would lessen the burden by removing those where they weren't what the little girl had to see every day. So dad had a garage sale and sold a lot of mom's stuff. Gave away stuff, and the little girl wasn't exactly sure what was going on. Did dad not love mom? There's a lot of spiritual burden about what did God do and what was happening in my life, and it was all blowing up. A lot of people came to those garage sales and picked up items, and the dad gave away some of the things to some friends, and life went on. Things were boxed up, kind of went on with life. But the spiritual burden was so there for that young teenage girl as she went through those years without her mom. Well, there came a joyous time in this young girl's life, a time she was going to be married. And you know the church always has wonderful showers, don't they? They had used to church. They grew up in Texas. They had like massive showers, and it was a cool thing to watch. Well, this unusually shaped box, wrapped up thing showed up at this shower. Well, a young girl now in her 20s opened up the box, and inside was this milk jug. And she looked at that milk jug and knew exactly where it came from. You see, one of the ladies at the church had gone to those garage sales, and she said, you know what I need to do? I need to collect as many of these items as I can. Because the dad right now doesn't understand the burden. But I'm going to hold these items, and I'm going to bear this burden until 1 year, when that little girl grows up, is getting ready to start her own family, I can bring these gifts back that I know her mother would have wanted her to have. And not only this, but each shower, that lady showed up with another item from her mother's treasure chest. And how do I know this story so well? That little girl is my wife. This can has traveled with us for 28 years of our marriage, everywhere we go. It holds the esteem of guarding our front door and watching our children come in and out, come and go. And every once in a while, Karen will say, maybe we should throw that old thing away. And now I say, nope. It's rusting in the bottom. It's no telling. I think it's empty. I emptied most of the stuff out. But the burden that was carried by our friend named Betty Choate, a burden that was shared by Reg's mom as she came and put makeup on Karen's mom's face so that she could receive visitors and feel confident, was a burden that at the time they may have been carrying for Karen's mother, but it was a spiritual burden that they were really carrying for Karen. Because this burden that Karen at 13 could not bear. It wasn't in her capacity to gather that, But there were a group of women that were under the law of Christ that said, we can do nothing else but bear this young child's burden. We have to hold it, and we have to treasure it, and someday we can release it back to her. And that's what they did. That's what this old beat-up milk can will always represent to me. And what it meant for me when she gave it to Karen was now she knew that Karen didn't have to bear this burden alone. That's right. There was this inadequate 20-year-old guy that was going to try to bear it with her and have to load this thing in trucks and carry it all over Texas into Colorado just to do it. And now that burden, you see, what's amazing about burdens when they're carried under the law of Christ is they become treasures. I don't want you to think of the burdens in your life that you've given under the law of Christ, to those that surround you, just by doing something good, that you at the moment thought, this is the worst possible thing that could ever happen to me. But when that burden is lifted up by those that are under the law of Christ, it becomes a treasure that you would never let go. And that's what Paul is telling us. That's what we're free to do. That's where our freedom comes from. That's how we restore someone gently. That verse about carrying each other's burdens fills the law of Christ full. And think what that looks like. Because when we start doing that, Paul says, and if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. It's not about you. Stop comparing yourself to things. Stop looking at this stuff. It's not about you. You're deceiving yourself. Right. He says it's about other ones. He said, test your own actions. Look at the reasons you're doing stuff. I just know that Betty Choate, when she was holding on to this milk jug, wasn't going, well, someday Karen's going to think I'm the greatest person in the world because I saved this for her. Betty Choate took her action and said, I don't need a milk jug. Knowing Betty, she has 15 of these because she probably painted it with Karen's mom. But she tested that action and said, why am I holding on to this? This isn't about Betty. This is about Christ. And that's what we do. Because he says, then you can take pride in yourself. Wow. Does that sound weird to you? Then he can take pride in himself without comparing himself to somebody else. Think about that part of the verse. It almost sounds like stuff we're not taught at church, doesn't it? When do you back up and say, because I'm doing this through Christ, I can take pride in myself for applying this to Christ? Because I've allowed Christ to develop in me something that's good. What does that look like? I just want us to dive into that. That has been something I'm working with some kids at Denver West High School. We have a young boy who's a really talented young boy playing baseball. The other day I walked up to him and he was just down on himself. And he's not the fastest pitcher that we have, or the fastest runner, or the best hitter, but he's really good. And I looked at him, and he was so down at practice. I said, what's wrong? He said, I can't do it like those other kids. I said, you don't have to. They can't do it like you. And he said, no. And I asked him, I said, who told you that you're not good enough? He said, I don't know. And I said, how much are you worth? Not much. He's 16. And he doesn't feel like he's worth anything. Look at his own actions. Look at who he's comparing to. You notice that Paul doesn't say, well, compare yourself to Christ and then you'll feel horrible. He doesn't say that, does he? Look at yourself and how you're living under the law of Christ, and then take pride in how you're living. That's what Paul's saying. Look at how we're developing ourselves. Look at what we're going to. Don't compare yourself to someone else. He says here, for each one should carry his own load. And of course, he's talking about working and living and taking care of ourselves. And then he goes on to say, those that are sharing the word with you, share your stuff with them and help them out. He's not saying that's not the way to do it. He wants you to do that. But he says, don't be deceived in verse 7. Don't be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man is going to reap what he sows. Unfortunately, I look at this boy, and this is the verse he's living on right here. It's not that he's sowing just to the sinful nature and all the bad, the body. The only field he's ever worked has been a one that's like this, where you have to get out there and compare yourself and be the best and do the best, or you're going to be a failure. And I told him, I said, son, let's don't do that. I said, I want the mirror to be the happiest place in your house. When you look at yourself, that you don't see this horrible, useless young man. I said, my goal for you is to look in that mirror and see someone that's worthy. See someone that has unsurpassable worth. See someone that when you walk out, it's just because of whose you are is what gives you your health. It gives you who you are. It gives you your benefits. And he tells us, don't be mocked. God's not going to be mocked. If you sow to please that sinful nature, from that nature, you'll reap destruction. Think about that. What time of this week did you do this? What time this week did you get caught up in this angst to say, if I just did this, or I compared myself to that, and I want to be this, knowing that it's just destructive, knowing it's not going to last. Then he says, the one who sows to please the Spirit. Let me ask you something. Where does the Spirit live? So if it lives in us, is that where the Spirit lives? So if we sow to please the Spirit that lives inside of us, what happens? From the Spirit we'll reap eternal life. And when will you know that? If the Spirit lives in you and you're sowing to please the Spirit that's in you and you know that you're going to enjoy eternal life, when do you know that? Is that like, well, I sure hope when I die I know it? No, it's now. If that Spirit of life is living in you and you're sowing to please the Spirit of life that's living in you, every day you know you have eternal life. It's not some future proclamation. It's right now. We take this Spirit that we're going to sow to please the Spirit. It's so easy to put the sinful nature inside of us. But Paul says we sow the Spirit that actually lives in us. The Spirit of life. And we sow that Spirit and we reap eternal life. Stop counting your time on earth by years and start counting it by eternity. How does that change your day? A lot of people say, I don't want to have any more birthdays. I don't. I'm going to live forever. How does that change your day? Every day you're sowing to feed an eternal Spirit inside of you. Everything you do is to feed something eternal, not mundane and daily, not something that just lasts a minute or two, but it's something that you're feeding that is eternal and lasts forever. Yes. Think about how that changes your daily life. Think how that changes the way you see the world. Our world lives so much on time clocks and on calendars and all these other things that tell us how long things last. And Paul says, no, sow to a Spirit that's about eternity. I was listening to a story on NPR this week about a man who practices dying. It was incredible. The thing that stuck in my head is he said every night he lays in bed and breathes out and goes and falls asleep thinking that was his last breath out and waits for the joy of what the next breath in will be. And he says he slept so peacefully every night because he's not bound by this temporal body that we live in, but he's opened by this eternal Spirit that he knows is inside of him. And that, Paul says, let us not become weary in doing good. Don't become weary in doing good. Weariness is a timed thing, isn't it? Weariness is a wearing down and counting down and, oh my goodness, one more time, or I got to do that again. Those are all time things, but we're not time-bound beings. That's not our nature. That's not who we are. Don't be weary in doing good, because at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Think about that. Don't be weary, because we're going to reap a harvest. What would it be to actually live that way? Think about how that would feel. Just kind of internalize what that would feel like. Because I'm sure we've all felt weary. But what would it actually feel like to just not grow weary in doing good? You see, there are a lot of obvious points of when evil will attack you. And when Paul makes statements like this, it flies in my face. It's like, well, guess someone's going to make you feel weary. And there's a lot of battle points that are going to come, and we have to start relying, I think, on what a lot of Galatians has told us about freedom and about spirit and living in the spirit and the fruits of the spirit, so we can count those things off. But what would it feel like to reap a harvest? It's an analogy that a lot of us don't use. My harvest last year was 10 tomatoes. I don't know that that's a harvest. It was a mild harvest. But I remember a day growing up on my parents' best friend's farm, and he sowed cotton in Texas. And I remember we would go out and see these little tiny plants, and the field was full of these plants. And it's really cool when the cotton bolls open up and there's these puffy white things, and you don't want to pick them because they'll tear your hands to pieces. Then they have these machines that gather them all up. And I remember he had this trailer with these giant wooden sides on it, and they would fill that thing with cotton. I mean, it was enormous. And take it to the cotton gin. Man, I sound really old. But I remember seeing it as a little bitty boy. I remember seeing this. And I thought all of that came from that one field. And it had several bales, and they were just bigger than fit on this stage. And I remember Othan, that was his name, would sit back and go, it's a good harvest this year. It's a good crop. And we would look at those giant bales of cotton. And I thought, man, that is amazing. What would it be that says, for at the proper time? Oh, did you notice the wording that Paul says? We will reap a harvest. Who's we? Who do you think the we is that Paul's talking about here? It doesn't say God's going to just reap it, does he? God seems to be including us in this harvest. We reap harvest. That's not about just getting rich. Think of what we've sown. We've sown goodness. What are you going to reap from goodness? Probably closets full of milk jugs with holes all in them. Or sundries like that. Harvest of uncountable things. So the therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people. If you don't get anything out of the book of Galatians, could you please get that? Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people. Think about that. Is that something you can do this week? Is it? I mean, really? Do you think the opportunity for you to do good might come up this week, in the next 7 days, that the opportunity to do something good might happen before you get through with lunch. Let us do good. And then he says, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. Look around. Look around. Is there any believers in here? What does this church do well? Especially to those who belong to the family of believers. What else do we need to say? Is there a great ending to this sermon? No. It's just go do this. What more? I mean, I'm going to have to get up here and just pontificate on this. Just do it. We live in a world where this doesn't happen. Evidently, Paul lived in a world where it didn't happen that much either. Why are we still saying this 2,000 years later, people? I would hope Paul would come up and go, really? I have to preach the same sermon that I preached in Galatia? In Lakewood? Come on. Haven't we moved beyond? In a lot of ways we have. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. But it's just applicable today, isn't it? Do good. Oh, and what happens from doing good? A harvest. A harvest. Are you ready for a harvest? Let's go do good. Look at this week. I put on their cards this week. It says, this week I'm going to call, and I just left a blank, and I'm going to encourage them. Who is that person? I pray right now, maybe you'll fill in that card right now of who that person is. I'm going to call this person. I'm going to do this one act to do good. Who is it? Take a second right now and think. Who is it? Take a minute right now and pray for the opportunity to do good. Who is it in this room you need to encourage today? Pray about that. Carry each other's burdens. And in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ.